This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode number 127. Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Well, welcome back. It is Monday, Veterans Day here, so I'm sorry I'm a little bit behind. And I've missed in the last episode to thank all of the veterans out there. If there's anyone here who is listening who has served our country or knows someone who has served this beautiful country or any country, I thank you. Really, really, I am so grateful for all that is provided to us and the safety that is provided to us because of the people who serve. So thank you so much. I am home alone on a Monday, which never happens, but my kids are actually off with their grandfather, and he's a veteran, and so they're celebrating together, and it makes me so happy to know that they understand the beauty of veterans and all that's being done. So just feeling really grateful for that. Okay. It's episode 127. I am sitting here. I have a warm cup of tea. So cheers to you all. Go make a pause and make a cup of tea if you'd like to sit with me and have a tea with me together. And today we have an amazing guest. This is a really helpful, everybody's going to feel like this applies to them in some way, shape, or form. Before we go into that, let's get a little bit of housekeeping done. All right. So, of course, most importantly, let's do the I Did a Hard Thing segment of the episode. I put in a request in the private Facebook group called CBT School Campus. If anyone's listening and you haven't yet joined, please do. It's the safest, coolest, most amazing group of human beings on the planet. It blows me away just how incredibly amazing and compassionate they are. But I posted and said, who's got a hard thing? You know, I want to know. I'm going to post it on the podcast. And I swear I could have chosen any of them, the most brave people doing the most brave things. But I chose one and I loved it. And I'm sure I'll probably be posting some of the others in future episodes because they were all so worthy of being put in this segment. Okay, here we go. Yesterday and today, I drank a whole glass of water from the tap in my bathroom, which terrifies me. I cooked food, which I actually ate. Yikes, they've written. And took the garbage down and sorted the recycling without plastic gloves. And then they've got a huge smiley face emoji. They continue to say, housekeeping and cooking with contamination fears can be very challenging, but this morning I looked around my apartment and realized I felt more safe and good in this space than I have for a long time. Small wins, heart emoji. And all I could think of was, small wins? This is huge wins. This is huge wins. So amazing, amazing work. They asked to be anonymous. Oh my gosh, such huge work. So no, that's not a small win. That is a mega, ginormous, gigantic, humongous win. So congratulations on that. Keep powering forward. It doesn't matter whether it's a big or a small win. Really, it doesn't. I'm posting this and it's so great, but if you're doing one of those things or half of those things, that's fine. Amazing, amazing work. I'm so incredibly honored that we can be together and celebrate in these incredible hard things that you're doing. Amazing, amazing, amazing. Okay. All right. Couple of other things. On Friday, let me take a look. Friday the 15th, we are launching BFRB School. It is an online course, a video course, just like ERP School, but it is for people who have hair pulling and skin picking, nail biting, any body-focused repetitive behavior. It is a 3.5-hour course, I think. It is decked out with the science-based tools to help you manage your BFRB, whether that be hair pulling and skin picking. I actually created it late last year, but it has taken me quite a while. Of course, you all know this year kind of got turned upside down for me. And so finally, here I am before the end of the year, pulling through, getting my goals met. I'm like, I cannot let the year go by. I have to get this course out. It is so wonderful and so something I hold so deep in my heart. There's a whole ton of stuff about lifestyle and changing lifestyle habits to help with creating a recovery-based lifestyle that thrives. And it's for you guys. So I can't wait. I can't wait to share it with you. If you go to cbtschool.com, you can go to online courses. It is right there. It's called BFRB School. It is $197. And so that's ultimately less than one session of face-to-face therapy that, for a typical BFRB specialist. And it's chock full of the whole treatment tools that I use. And again, I've said this about ERP School, and I'll say it again about BFRB School. This is the training manual I give my therapists who treat BFRB. So I have employees. I have 5 incredible therapists who work for me in my office in Calabasas. They are just the coolest human beings. And when I take on new therapists to help me, serve my clients, this is the training I give them. I don't send them to a workbook. I don't send them to, anywhere else. I really want to make sure that they get these same training tools that I use with my clients. So go check it out, cbtschool.com. It's right there for you. Check on online courses, and I'll also link to it in the show notes. So, you can go straight there. Okay. That's it for right now. Lots of amazing, fun, cool things coming up. Some really cool free things. I will continue to give you updates on those. But for right now, let's go to the show. All right. This is an amazing, amazing interview with Giulia Suro. She is a Ph.D. psychologist. She is what we would consider an acceptance and commitment therapist. She treats using acceptance and commitment therapy. And the reason I love this episode is it's for everyone. We don't address one particular problem here. We're looking at how to get unstuck, how to change the way you look at life, how to change the way you look at your struggles, how to change the way you approach your own suffering. And, I loved this episode. I felt really empowered after I listened to it. And I felt, even more allied with the acceptance and commitment model because I use it in my life every day. And I don't think I actually recognized that until we were talking about it. And I was like, oh, yeah, these are tools I'm using. I'm just using them so often I forget to call them ACT. And she talks about some amazing, amazing ways to apply it in big areas in your life and in small areas of your life. So thank you, Dr. Giulia Suro. She talks all about where you can contact her at the end of the episode, so please do that. She also has an amazing workbook called Learning to Thrive. I will be linking that in the show notes as well. And, amazing, amazing, amazing. So thank you for sticking by me and supporting me. Thank you for showing up for yourself, because just listening here is you taking care of yourself. And I'm so happy and honored to be a part of that process. So here's the episode. Enjoy, guys, and I will see you in 1 week. Well, welcome. This is a really exciting podcast episode. We have here Giulia Suro. She is a psychologist, and she is here to first of all, before I say what we're here to do, welcome. I'd actually love for you to introduce yourself and tell us what you're wanting to talk about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. So I'm a psychologist, an ACT lover, acceptance and commitment therapy. And among the kind of many other professional things I do, that is what I'm most passionate about and I'm very eager to talk about and share.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I know I've spoken about ACT on the podcast before. We've had Stephen Hayes on, who is like the god of ACT.
And those were amazing interviews, especially the second one was a really beautiful conversation.
I thought so too. He's just such a brilliant man. But I love that you're going to be here today to speak with us about how people may apply this to their everyday life. And I'm really excited because I know it's something that I haven't done super well in terms of discussing what it really means and the tools and going deeper into that practice. So I'm so thrilled to have you here as an ACT lover to do that. So share with me why ACT, like why you got into acceptance and commitment therapy.
So interestingly, I went to a graduate school program that was pretty classic cognitive behavioral therapy. And that was my training. And I actually was initially really interested in severe mental illness, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and interested in working in kind of residential settings. That's not what I ended up doing, but that's kind of where I started. And one of my first training experiences was at the VA in Miami, and they were pilot testing ACT for psychosis. And to me, it was such a revolutionary, it really felt like it at the time, and this wasn't that long ago, but it was a while ago, approach for something like psychosis or schizophrenia, to practice mindfulness, values work, all of these really beautiful concepts, which I hadn't heard in my training. And I started to read more about it. I had a really wonderful supervisor and mentor, and it just felt like home. You know, it was something that sit well with me. It changed the way I thought about myself and my own kind of path. And I've had such amazing experiences sharing it with clients going forward.
And what kind of clients do you treat now? Like, you obviously practice this in your private practice. Who do you practice this with, including yourself, of course?
The great thing about ACT is that it's really an approach. It's to seeing things. It's a new framework. It's transdiagnostic. It's different than other theoretical orientations or psychological interventions in that way. It's not like CBT for depression. It's offering a new way of living. And so for that reason, anyone can use it, regardless of what they're going through psychologically, because one of kind of the underpinnings of the ACT philosophy is that just being human is something we all share, and it comes with a lot of highs and lows, and that's something that's guaranteed for every single individual. So it kind of provides a way to navigate that. In my private practice, I mostly see eating disorder clients where I found it works really beautifully with that population.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that too. In fact, even as a clinician, I will admit, like, I'm not the best clinician. I'm totally happy to admit that. And I know that sometimes when I'm feeling stuck with a client, I just divert to that because I'm like, that you can't go wrong with. Like, no matter what intersection you've had in a session, we can always go back to just looking at values and the mindfulness tools. So for me, I find it such like a wonderful security blanket to have those tools.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm sure you can relate too. Like, I sometimes find myself in sessions feeling anxious or second guessing myself or wondering, like, can I help this person or what am I going to do with this? And it's like a place I can always go back to. You know, what's my value here? What am I feeling? Am I willing to share that and expand into it a little bit?
Yeah, so good. So good. Okay, so let's peel it back a little bit.
Sure.
So in your definition and in your experience, what is acceptance and commitment therapy? Like, what does that look like in your office or in your practice in your head?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would also reiterate, turn to Stephen Hayes, listen to your podcast with him to really kind of learn the technical terms. But for me, what it looks like in session, I typically open sessions with a few moments of mindfulness, whether it's sitting or breathing, or sometimes just observing kind of how we're both feeling as we're starting a session, what emotions are coming up or thoughts, how busy is your mind right now, is a way to kind of set the tone. And then I think, a few of the big differences between like an ACT session and other types of therapy would be a lot of it is spent in the here and now. That is where the magic happens from an ACT framework. That's where we have the potential to make change, to feel, right? The past is gone, the future is yet to come. So a lot of kind of in the moment processing. And then another big difference is from an ACT framework, we wouldn't focus on symptom reduction, which is something that can be a little bit confusing for clients when they first come in. But I don't ask, how's your anxiety this week? How's your depression this week? That's not the aim. It will ideally be a byproduct, which sometimes can take a little bit of time to see. But we're not focusing on symptoms. We're not focusing on getting better, feeling better, anything like that.
Right. And someone, I'm guessing people who are listening would say, well, why would I do it if it doesn't give me symptom reduction? What would be your response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really common question. And I think there's kind of two components to that answer. One is that in our kind of crazy Western world, we become very aversive to psychological experiences that we don't like, that we deem as negative or wrong. Right now, I hear like so frequently, I don't like negative emotions, right? Like emotions have been classified as negative or positive. Most of my clients, when they come in for the first session, say, I want to feel better. I don't like how I'm feeling. This isn't okay. I want to make this better, whether they say that explicitly or not. And from an acceptance and commitment therapy perspective, we want to open up to all internal experiences. They're not good or bad. They just are. Some of them can give us really important information about our needs. Some of them are kind of hard to explain and a little weird, but they're all time limited and they come and go, and that's cool. We can just provide a space for them to do that. So to kind of develop more of an acceptance-based attitude with some of our fluctuations, that's not to say that living with severe depression is okay. That's something we want to work on. And that kind of leads to the second component, is that by practicing the ACT skills and working towards living a more meaningful and value-driven life, as we start to change those patterns of behavior and build them into our life, we see the symptoms go down on their own. So I always reassure clients, we know this works. It's a different path and it's going to feel kind of weird and paradoxical, but we know that this works. So trust in the process. And let's take a break from talking about your depression. Let's give you a break from focusing on your anxiety.
Right. So just to break it down for people who, we didn't speak about this much with Stephen Hayes, is you address the acceptance piece and the importance of that. And there's so much mindfulness that goes into that practice. What's the commitment piece, and where does that fit in to treatment or the practice of daily life?
So this actually, and this is my personal experience, I think really fits well with therapists who are used to a traditional CBT model or even like motivational interviewing. And that it's great to talk about it in therapy, but what's going to make it happen? We talk about these values, and I find that values are such an exciting thing to talk about in session, and it feels so good, right? But then it's like, how are we going to actually translate that to action that can sometimes even take a few weeks or months to kick in? So it's not enough to just talk about it. At its core, ACT is really about behavioral change. It kind of comes from these old behavioral models of reinforcement. And that when we do things that are values driven, it's self-reinforcing. It makes us want to do more, but those first few steps can be hard.
Right. I love it. Okay. So this is so great. And so let's sort of move into now, like, how may we practice this? How can we incorporate this into our lives? Now, as you said, everybody listening is managing something. I can pretty much guarantee that, right? Like everybody who listens, everyone who's out there existing, you mightn't see it on social media, but everybody's dealing with something. How might they apply the ACT model to the struggle or struggles that they're having?
So I think one important way is to kind of do an inventory of what are the ways that you might be fighting or resisting the feelings that come up around these struggles, right? It sucks to feel sad. It's hard to feel, it can suck to feel sad. It's hard to feel humiliated, right? Or rejected, these tough feelings, right? I think all of us, if we could wave a magic wand and never feel shame again, we would all sign up for that, right? Because it's horrible. And yet it's part of the price of admission. We're all going to feel it multiple times for the rest of our lives. So what are the ways that we've tried to kind of trick ourselves to getting out of it, whether by distraction or numbing, substance use, or trying to think our way out of it? Whenever we feel fear, do we make lists or do we worry, right? And kind of evaluate, like, how is this really working for me? And oftentimes what clients see is that in the short term, it is giving some relief. It's working in the short term, giving some relief from these feelings. But in the long term, it's backfiring. It's kind of breeding more distress. It's invalidating. It's not letting ourselves feel our kind of pure organic feelings, right? It's reinforcing the message that certain feelings aren't okay. So starting to do some of that work, and that's a concept called creative hopelessness. And then values, I could talk all day about values, but the coolest thing about values is they're always there. We always have them. And when things are hard, it's kind of like this internal compass to lead us forward and help us kind of take our next few steps wherever we're going.
Right. So I'm curious, when I talk with clients about values as a clinician, I'm interested to hear what you say. Some people get really overwhelmed with the incredible amount of values or options for what their values could be, right? And I think too, what I've seen clients do is, you might suggest this idea of values and they kind of sit up in their chair and they list all the values they think they should have.
Yes.
Right? Like,
yes.
Oh no, I want to be kind and I want to be, a good citizen and I want to be a good mom and all of these.
Right.
So what process do you go through with your clients to help them define what are their, in fact, values?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's definitely a few strategies. I like to use the metaphor that I think is found in a lot of ACT books and things like that, where kind of values are like our directions on a compass. So you never fully get to north. And then sometimes my clients will say, but there's the North Pole. And but there's no south, there's no place. It's just direction we're moving in. So sometimes clients will say, my value is being a good mom. We're looking for things like patience, kindness, things that we'll never achieve, right? We'll never be able to say, like, I'm here, it's done, I've completed patience, right? Things we're always moving towards. So when my clients are going through really tough periods, when they feel lost or scared or lonely, I sometimes say or ask them, what direction do we want to move towards? What is going to guide us? What is going to be our North Star here? Let's pick a word and kind of don't think about it too hard. Go with your gut response. Like, what do you want to define our next few steps? And that actually tends to evoke some pretty cool values.
Yeah. That's so interesting that you say that. I mean, one of the tools that I use is from the Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, which is sort of describing what you want people to say at your funeral.
Yes.
And I think that the problem with that, but it's also a beautiful process, is it then makes you face this idea that you actually will die one day, which can be problematic in many ways. So I think my question is, when someone is facing fear, a lot of the listeners here on this podcast, as you know, are highly struggling with anxiety. In those moments, of course, because our fight and flight is out, it may actually sort of say, well, my values is to make fear go away. Like, I want relief, like I just want relief. What would you say to that if they said my value was to have the removal of anxiety?
And that's a great point. And just to deviate for a second, I totally remember when I was first starting doing ACT, what people would say at your funeral exercise was almost too hard for me to do. And so those first few years, I actually altered it to your 100th birthday, because it was even like, it was too hard it's hard. It's hard to face, right? So in that case, I would turn to, which I think are Stephen Hayes's kind of classic values-based prompts, which is what would your hero do? Like, name who's your hero, and anyone, your dad, a teacher, someone you don't even know. What would they do here? Or I think there's four of them. What would your pain tell you to do? What is your fear telling you? And that one could be a little bit more tricky, but pain, heroes, I forget the other two right now, but kind of looking at what is someone we would aspire to be or someone that we really respect. What would they do?
Right. And I love doing that because I find actually and you talk about this being a behavioral modification is, let's say I had a client just a few weeks ago and we spoke about this, and she had said she was going into a meeting that she was really anxious about. And she said, I want to come into the meeting like Kamal Clooney. Is that Amal Clooney?
Oh, yeah.
Right. And she'd sort of imagined this poised, graceful woman. And I'd said to her, okay, good. Now I want you to actually stand up and I want you to act like her now. Right. So for her, it was like, oh, you actually want me to, like, we're not just saying ideas. I'm like, yeah, I want you to sit like her right now. Like, I want you to show me what that would look like. And that changed so much for her in sort of embodying that experience.
Totally. Yeah, I think we neglect kind of the mind-body connection and how actions can have a really powerful impact on our headspace.
I love it. Yeah. Okay, great. That's sort of getting in touch with values. What about for those who are doing a kind of a big inventory of their life and they want to get really clear? Is there like a worksheet or something that you use to gather values? Like, what tools do you use?
Yeah, there's a beautiful worksheet. I think it's like a bullseye. I think it's called the bullseye worksheet. And the bullseye is divided, I believe, into quadrants. And each quadrant represents kind of a different domain of your life. And I don't quote me on this, but I think it's like vocation, work, personal growth, and then maybe spirituality. And you basically identify kind of your values. You do some work around kind of coming up with your values. And then on the bullseye, you mark how close or far away you are from that value at the moment. And it kind of gives a visual of how closely you're living with these values that may be very important to you. But again, if we're not seeing it in the action, it doesn't translate to much.
Right. So true. So true. Okay. So you've identified some of your values with a client. What would you do then? What is your kind of flow in getting the client coming in with this problem? What would you do in the next step to help them move forward?
My next step would be to start working on diffusion, which I think all of the skills on the Hexaflex are important. But if I had to pick one that I think has the biggest bang for its buck, in a lot of ways, it would be diffusion, because it's so contradictory to how we're taught to relate to our thinking. And the idea is really to develop an objective, mindful base stance from our thoughts and to detach from them, to not change them, to notice them, observe them, but to not buy into them as facts.
Right. So if someone were to have a thought like something bad, like I feel like something bad is going to happen today, just a generic thought that I think a lot of us have, how might they diffuse from that?
I would first say, let's practice fusing with it. Let's see what it's like when we're really, really fused. Let's both of us like simmer in it, repeat it over and over, and notice how that changes things. And even as I'm kind of talking to you now, I notice my heart rate going up a little bit. I might notice some other fear-based thoughts, right? And oftentimes what I'll share with clients is that our human mind loves to confirm itself. So give it one thing, it's going to want to provide lots of evidence and reasons why that's true, right? So it'll hardly ever stick with, I'm going to have a bad day today. It'll be, I'm going to have a bad day today because this, and don't forget this, and all of these other reasons, right? And then we have this kind of snowball experience. Right. So I'd kind of use that to kind of overshoot a little bit and really like dig into what it's like when we're fused. And then to kind of take a step back. And a lot of times what I do, this is also, again, a really kind of classic ACT exercise, is let's practice. We're not going to change the thought, I'm going to have a bad day today, but let's practice saying to ourselves, I'm having the thought that I'm going to have a bad day today. And let's simmer with that for about 30 seconds. And sometimes we'll repeat it to each other. Sometimes we'll kind of sit silently and practice mulling that over in our heads. And then let's talk about how that feels different. And for most clients, that feels much less intense. There's less activation. You feel more removed. And then sometimes we'll even add to it, I notice that I'm having the thought that I'm going to have a bad day, and get even a little bit more space. And we can talk about in the moment how the experience changes.
Right. So let's troubleshoot. I love to troubleshoot. Okay.
Right?
I would say 70% of the time when I practice that for the first time, and I know a lot of listeners may be like going, oh, I didn't realize this is how this works. So a lot of the time when they'll go, I'm noticing that I'm having the thought, often I'll notice clients stop the activity and go, this isn't working. I'm still anxious, right? This is quote unquote isn't working. And everybody knows my theory on that, which is, what's your definition of working? But
Right.
Would you recommend your clients and patients do this with sensations of anxiety as well? How would you break it up?
That's a good question. So sometimes what I do in those cases, and I think sometimes my clients might get a little mad at me, but let's just start every sentence with, I notice.
Yeah.
This isn't working. Oh, you notice it's not working.
Good. Okay, good.
Okay, so you're noticing you have some anxiety. How do you notice that? And sometimes I get death stares, but we're just noticing here. We're observing, and even just practicing that observation by definition gives us distance. And you're right, we can't make it go away forever. But what is it like to get a little bit of space and see it for what it is?
Yeah. And I love that because they'll say, this isn't working. And you'll say, I'm noticing that it's not working. And then they'll say, that makes me mad. And you'll go, so you're noticing that makes you mad. Right? You just keep following it. Yeah. Yeah. And we're laughing. It's incredibly painful.
Yeah.
And so, as we practice this diffusion, interestingly, I think, particularly of a lot of the clients that I see, they actually don't want to notice their thoughts because of the fear of their thoughts.
Right.
Is that where the commitment work would come in? Like, how would you get someone on board to want to notice their thoughts?
Absolutely. So here I would give maybe even a little bit of psychoeducation on exposure. Act like all of these things that we know work is an exposure therapy. Just by talking about your thoughts, you're exposing yourself to them. And we know exposure works if you keep it up, if it's repeated. And ultimately, I want my clients to know your thoughts can't hurt you. They can be really, really scary and mean and nasty, and they're still only thoughts. So sometimes what I'll do also, another diffusion technique, is let's kind of take a stream of thinking. Let's take your anxiety-based thinking and write it down, like free write it down. And then hold that piece of paper up and carry it with you. And notice kind of what it's like to have it in your pocket. And when are you in it? When are you away from it? What is it like to kind of know it's there? And that's kind of another way to do some exposure work and to practice seeing it objectively.
Right. So good. Such a good idea. Because you're right. So much of anxiety is staring it in the face. So that exposure work is really important. Right. Okay, good. What are some of the troubleshooting you have to do in session? That's the most common one I have to face. For you, what kind of roadblocks do people come to with this practice?
I think my biggest roadblock is willingness, which ties into the commitment piece. Are you willing to take everything we've talked about and do it when it matters? And I have some clients who come to therapy and in theory kind of are willing to do the work, but when it comes down to it, they're not quite there. And that's actually, as a therapist, it's kind of hard for me to sit with, right? Like, I want the best for them. I want things to start changing, and you see the potential. And, sometimes, especially the eating disorders population, it's a tough illness and it can just take time. So kind of sitting with that and feeling it and noticing it and continuing to check in about it.
Right. So true. So it brought up a question that I have often that comes up in session, which is, this sort of conflicting values Like, I really want to do exposure, like with a lot of the anxiety treatment I do is exposure and response prevention. So the client will come and they'll say, I really want to do exposure. I really want to stare my fear in the face. And they come in and they're generating a lot of willingness, and they're really leaning into this new idea of like, yeah, I really want that. But then in the moment out in the field, it becomes lower on the priority list. So what might somebody do to help them continue to generate that level of willingness that they may have initially?
I sometimes use a willingness exercise. It might be hard to talk out because it's very experiential, but kind of asking clients to first to stand and then to practice jumping forward without jumping, and to notice what that feels like. And I'll ask them, what is this like? And they'll usually say awkward, weird, right? And then I'll ask them to maybe stand on a book that's like an inch thick and ask them, are you willing to jump off? And they usually say yes, and they'll jump off. And then I'll ask them to stand on a chair maybe and ask them if they're willing to jump off. And sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. And then I ask, are you willing to jump off the roof of the building? And they all say no, usually. And if they don't, then we need to deviate. But
right.
I use that to kind of illustrate that willingness is a choice. You get to decide what conditions are best for you to take a leap, and to validate it is a leap, and leaps can be scary, and that's totally real. And what do you need to know? What pieces of information do you need to have in order to take a leap off of a new height? And sometimes use that to build motivation around a new exposure. And then as for the first part of the exercise, jumping but not jumping, I use that to show like you can't kind of jump halfway. Willingness is either doing it or not. Saying you want to do it, it doesn't really count, right? And I probably frame that in a more gentle way, at least I hope I do, but that this is about the action, and it's either a positive or a negative. And if you're not ready, or if you need more information, that's okay. But let's talk about what that might look like.
Right. Yeah, it's such a hard piece of the work, right? Because, people do want to get better, and they do want to feel empowered by what's going on with them, even when they're really struggling. But that disconnect does happen. Is there a tool that you feel everybody, of course, besides diffusion, is there a tool that you feel like everyone should take in their back pocket throughout the day, particularly if they have anxiety?
Contact with the present moment, which is ACT's term for mindfulness. Being present, right? Anxiety is such a fear-based experience. And I think, at least for a lot of my clients, it's so cognitively consuming. So many, like just the fatigue of worry, of lists of fears, right? Learning how to ground in the present moment would be, I think, the tool that everyone could use all day, every day.
Yeah, it's such a muscle that we have to strengthen, right? And I love that ACT relies so heavily on that because, I think one criticism I have had of ACT is the Hexaflex can get confusing, right? Like, well, where do I use? Like, and where do I intervene, and with which one? Particularly when you're panicked, because you're not using a part of your brain that can think clearly. But that being present is like your go-to every time.
Yeah, it is true. And I'm not sure how you've handled this if you use ACT with your clients, but I've kind of gone back and forth between showing the Hexaflex and not. I've had some clients where that's been successful, and I've had others where it just ends up reinforcing the tangled cognitive stuff. And so I have many where I don't show it, or I don't even talk about the skills by name. But yeah, I think mindfulness is you can't go wrong.
Right. Yeah. And isn't that true of us all? I often will ask people at the beginning of session, like, how do you learn best? Right. I have a whiteboard. So I'm a really visual person. If I don't see it, I don't learn it. So visually, if it's up on the whiteboard, it's in my brain. Whereas other people have no interest in learning from a visual, that they like just to be spoken to. So I think that that's so true in all of our learning, our best learning methods, right? One thing I wanted to ask you and really take advantage of your skills here is, tell me a little more about the acceptance piece and how that plays into the work.
Yeah. So for acceptance, I really draw on a lot of Kelly Wilson's writing, and he's another, I believe he was one of Stephen Hayes' students. And I find a lot of Buddhist philosophy in his writing. ACT is not religious, but it takes from a lot of the noble truths of Buddhism, which the first one is life is suffering. And we are so rejecting of that in our society. And it's a shame, really, because that is our kind of the one thing we can all connect over. And yet we expend a lot of energy trying to pretend it's not true and trying to present it as if it's not true. So I do some kind of psychoeducation around that and also open up to, like, what if this is just hard? And it's hard for me and it's hard for you. And can we kind of share in this together? And what would that be like to not try and fight that or change that? That's kind of the path I take with acceptance.
Right. Yeah. Which is so much a part of the mindfulness stuff, isn't it, as well? In that when we suffer, we also judge ourselves for suffering, right? And that now we've got two problems, we've got suffering and self-judgment. So I love that acceptance takes away that judgment and allows us to sort of just sit in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I sometimes do a little bit of not really inner child work, but like, what would you imagine yourself as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old? I have a 17-month-old now, so it's like become a lot more real. But like, would you judge them for having emotions? What would you want to do if they came to you crying because they were scared or had a hard day? You'd want to hug them. I think about like hugging my son, and I feel filled with warmth and love. And can we find ways to turn that to yourself? And that question often makes my clients emotional because they've come so far away from that and they're so harsh to themselves. So I feel like that's a big chunk of the work.
Yeah, it is. It really is. I remember a therapist of mine, actually, my homework for the week is I had to find a photo of myself around a certain age, around 6 and 7, where I think I remember feeling anxiety for the first time. And I had to look at the photo and sort of speak to that child, right? So it's somewhat child work, but in that, you can diffuse from all your feelings and your emotions in that. That's that diffusion, because all of a sudden you're like, oh, I just want to hug that little girl, right?
Yeah. That's why I love actually the beginning of your podcast about giving a hug, because it's true. We all could use that, and yet it's so simple and very hard.
Totally. Yeah. And again, I think sometimes people, I remember we had Catherine de Monte on talking about receiving. And I think a big piece of this is actually receiving that love and openness and acceptance for ourselves. So it's such a huge part of this work as well. Is
totally.
Letting yourself off the hook and allowing yourself to receive like this present moment.
Right. And I think that actually can illuminate a lot of cognitive barriers to kind of self-love, these core beliefs deep down that I'm not lovable or I'm a fraud, I'm a loser, those sorts of things. And then starting to do some diffusion work around those core beliefs.
Right. Yeah, it's so beautiful. And I love that you bring all those pieces to it. And again, it's sort of where ACT can kind of come in from every angle and help us break down one experience of suffering, whatever it may be, right?
Totally.
I know we're running close to the end of our interview. Is there something about ACT that you would really want people to know? Like, is there a message about it that you feel you want to really drive home here?
There is. And this is something that I feel like at some point I share with every single client, and it's almost making me emotional saying it, but that there is nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. You are absolutely okay just the way you are. And maybe we're a little bit stuck, and we're going to find some ways to get you unstuck, but that there's nothing wrong, broken, messed up, screwed up, doomed about you at all. Right.
It's such an important message, right? Particularly, and this is why I really appreciate you coming on. And I fall into this pattern, I know, is looking at diagnosis so much, right? Like, well, what diagnosis do you have? And well, what's your pathology? You know what I mean? And the ACT model takes us away from that and sort of is like, no, we are all suffering. There is nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. We've just got a couple of tweaks to make.
Totally.
Right.
Totally.
And I feel like that is so important. Again, that's why I'm so grateful you're here, because I think I even fall into that trap of being, in this motion of trying to change people's lives, but we bring it back to being like, wait a second, we're all in this together. So I really appreciate you bringing that point. Every time I do a podcast, I usually walk away with like an aha moment for myself. I'm being like, okay, I'm going to shift my thinking, which is, there it is for me.
That's really cool. Wow. Yeah. No, it's so true. It's really true. I remember when the supervisor who first taught me ACT, I remember this clear as day. This was a formative moment for me. We were talking about a client with schizophrenia, and he wanted to start working, and he hadn't worked for like 20 years. He'd been living with his parents. And I asked her, like, do you think work is really possible for him? And she looked at me and said, I don't believe in limiting anyone.
Ooh,
and it was a total game changer. Yeah, it was a total game changer for me. And I hear that phrase, Dr. Andres Hyman, if you hear this, I don't think she will, I'll send it to her. But I hear that phrase every week.
Can you say it again? What did she say?
I don't believe in limiting anyone. And because of where I was in my training and her position, it was really meaningful. It kind of challenged a lot of what I'd learned about psychosis and schizophrenia, but it also kind of at its core, we feel, I think the stigma of having struggles with our mental health is very real. And we take on a sick role that can really hold us back.
Right.
So there's no limits here, regardless of what's going on in your headspace.
Right. I don't know if you remember, Ethan Smith has been on the podcast a couple of times, and he's talked about how his parents were told like that he won't get better. And he's the International OCD Foundation ambassador now. Like, he's just killing it. And I think I love Ethan for bringing that hope to people who, I know a lot of people have been told you can do this and you can't do that because of your anxiety. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it's such an important part of hope, and faith, and feeling like, I have a direction, a North Star.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you. This has been so beautiful, just so beautiful. So thank you.
I really appreciate you having me as a guest. I've been a follower of yours for a long time, so this is very exciting, and I have a lot of gratitude for getting the chance to speak with you.
Yeah, it's so good. How can people reach out to you, know about you, hear about your work?
I have a professional Instagram account that's Dr. Giulia Suro, and my name is spelled the Italian way, so you won't find me with a J. It's Giulia. So the handle is at Dr. DRGIULIA, S as in Sam, URO. And I also have a website that's www.juliasuro.com.
I will make sure we link that in the show notes. And thank you. Really, it's been so lovely. One of the things I love the most is I just never know who I'm going to meet through the podcast. It's so fun. And I do feel like this is the perfect complement on the Stephen Hayes interviews, because it's more of a clinical, like in the office approach. He's just so incredibly smart.
Yes.
I adore him. If he's listening, I adore him. Yeah. And sometimes I struggle to keep up with his brilliance. I'm way back here. And so I feel like this brings us, into more of like the office version of what he's talking about. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And if he is listening, I want to express my gratitude for bringing ACT into the world. As I said, it's been a total game changer for me personally and professionally. And I know for so many people too. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.